Hey everybody, welcome back. When we left off, World War II had started, but the United States was helping the Allies and not officially involved. But on December 7th, 1941, everything will change with the direct attack on US soil in the Hawaiian Islands and the loss of over 3,000 lives. President Roosevelt will go before Congress and ask for a declaration of war, and he will get the declaration of war. So I don't expect you to know a lot of specific dates, but December 7th, 1941, it's a date to know and certainly changes the history of the United States. So this section, we'll take a look at how the war starts for the United States, advantages, disadvantages going into the war, or the strengths and the weaknesses. We'll take a look at how we gear up. We're mobilizing for war, and we're going to learn a lot from World War I and apply that to mobilizing for World War II. And we'll see the economic benefits that World War II has on the United States. And then we'll move to the Pacific because Pearl Harbor is not the only location that is attacked in the Pacific. And we'll take a look at our leader, General Douglas MacArthur, in the Pacific as well. So let's start looking at strengths and weaknesses. You could also consider it advantages and disadvantages for the Allies and the Axis powers when the United States enters the war. So when we enter World War II, Axis powers have two big advantages. They've got firm control over the areas they've already invaded, and they were simply better prepared for war. The Axis powers stretch from the Soviet Union all the way to France. You've got Norway down to North Africa. So they've invaded these areas and they have control over them at this point. They've been preparing for war throughout the 1930s. They've been building up their military. They had been using their economy to prepare for war. So they certainly have some advantages at this point when we enter. However, we also have some advantages. Even though the Axis powers have control over their invaded areas, it's in ways a disadvantage also because they're so spread out, because they have forces that are trying to hold on in the east and in the west and in the north and in the south. They still got to hang on. And at this point, they haven't won. And they've been hanging on as long as possible. So the British, Soviet Union, they haven't been defeated yet, and now we're coming into the war. So that's an Allied advantage. And now we can utilize our strengths, our production. We've got factories that are ready to build weapons to help the Allies fight the war. And the Soviet Union military is an advantage also because they've got lots of numbers. So the more people you have, the more people you have to fight the war and also to support the war. So advantages, disadvantages, strengths, weaknesses when the U.S. Does officially enter World War II. Okay, here we go. Time to mobilize for war. So the United States is going to switch from a peacetime economy to a wartime economy. And that means every decision that our government makes, the focus is the war and how do we help the Allied powers out and win the war. And the good part about this is we have done this before. We have learned from mobilizing during World War I, and we're going to use what worked and focus those efforts on World War II. So we switch from peacetime to a wartime economy, and we're going to see some benefits in the United States. 1943, we have close to 500,000 workers employed in our government arsenals. We're not going to be worried about making Model Ts any longer. We're going to focus on making products for the war effort. So we are going to make planes and tanks and jeeps and guns and ships. And because we are making the planes and the tanks and the jeeps and the guns and the ships, we're going to see production boom and we're going to see unemployment drop. So during parts of the Great Depression, when we had 25% of our workforce unemployed, our unemployment rate is going to drop dramatically. So there are some economic benefits to the United States joining the war effort. If you're looking for a job, go to the coast, go to the Pacific coast, go to the Gulf Coast, go to some of the cities in the Midwest and the West, because lots of new factories are going to be built during this time period so that we can successfully mobilize for war. And it's not just productive in the cities, we're going to see farms productive also. Farmers are not only going to take care of us over here, they got to take care of the allies over there as well. So um, World War II is an economically productive time for us in the United States as we gear up and mobilize for war. So as we mobilize for war, our federal government is going to expand. In fact, our federal government is going to triple the number of people working for the federal government. So there's more jobs created there also. The War Production Board is the board that is created to increase military production. And the War Production Board has three priorities. Conversion of factories that are already existing to wartime production, building new factories for wartime production, and assigning raw materials to industry so that they have the supplies that they need to build the planes and the tanks and the jeeps and the guns and the ships for World War II. The Office of War Mobilization, another government agency, is going to coordinate all of the government agencies and focus on the production, distribution of consumer goods during this time period. The government will expand its control over the economy as well, and much like there were new taxes during World War I, there will be new taxes during World War II. Sale of war bonds, again, it worked during World War I, we'll use it during World War II also, and it's a very patriotic way to support the Allies. The OPA is created, the Office of Price Administration, and the Office of Price Administration, yeah, rationing. I'm drinking coffee. You know, my coffee is not being rationed yet, but coffee was an item that was rationed during World War II. And there was a list of items. What do we got? Gas, tires, coffee, sugar, meat, butter, canned goods. So at this point, well, I know it is getting kind of tricky to buy meat at the grocery store, um, but we're not out of it. And we'll fix that. Wage freezing, also a responsibility of the OPA. So mobilizing for war is going to require a lot of cooperation between our government and U.S. citizens during World War II. Okay, if we are mobilizing for war, we certainly need soldiers. So soldiers will be recruited with the 1940 Selective Training and Service Act, so the draft. And the draft ages are going to increase throughout the war. The Selective Training and Service Act is going to start ages 21 to 35, but then that will be increased from 18 to 45 as the war continues. And 2/3 of the Americans who do serve in World War II are drafted, but the rest are volunteering their efforts, including more than 300,000 women serving during World War II. And I think your book mentions the WAC, the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps. Mrs. Espenschied's mom, Dolores, was a WAC during World War II. And then there are also the WASPs, the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, who were flying planes during World War II. And when World War II is over, our female pilots are going to be asked to turn in their wings and become flight attendants. But we'll talk about that in contemporary American history. So mobilizing for war, again, every decision our government makes, it's about the war effort at this point, and how do we help the Allies win the war and we get our soldiers home as quickly and safely as possible. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor is just one part of the Japanese assault in the Pacific. They have a much larger Pacific offensive planned. They also attacked Clark Air Force Base on December 8th in the Philippines. And of course, the Philippines was territory we acquired after the Spanish-American War. Japanese, another victory, Battle of Java Sea is going to lead to their conquest of New Guinea. And in the Pacific, our troops and Filipino troops are going to be under the leadership of General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur, he was retired. He was called back into duty, and he accepted. He's a West Point grad. He was a leader at West Point. He served during World War I, so this isn't his first rodeo. But when President Roosevelt asked him to come back, he certainly does. So in the Pacific, Japanese forces are going to advance toward the capital city of Manila, and General MacArthur and his troops are going to be forced to evacuate. Clark Air Force Base had nearly been destroyed, so we have no air support, we have no naval support there. And our troops have to retreat to the Bataan Peninsula, and they have to retreat so quickly that they are unable to get the supplies that they need for this evacuation. President Roosevelt is going to call MacArthur back to Australia. And MacArthur, it's hard for him to leave his troops, but he makes a promise, a vow, I shall return. And he will make good on his promise to his troops, and he will return. Our soldiers are forced to surrender to the Japanese, and with their surrender, the Japanese force them in what becomes known as the Bataan Death March. And our soldiers are treated horrifically. Thousands of U.S. soldiers and Filipino lose their lives in the Bataan Death March. And unfortunately, their prisoner of war situation is not going to be any better. And that's one of the concerns that we'll have as the war continues. When our Allied forces stumble upon some of the prisoner of war camps, it's a horrific situation. We'll take a look at that when we get to the end of chapter 26. Or how about the end of chapter 27, since this is chapter 27? Anywho, the last part of this section takes a look at some of the fighting that's going on in the Pacific and some of the fighting in Europe and also in the Mediterranean. So we do see some U.S. victories, Battle of Coral Sea, Battle of Midway, Guadalcanal, and then we'll move back to the Mediterranean and North Africa, British pushing German troops out of Egypt and Libya, and Stalingrad. The Germans are eventually forced to surrender, and this is a turning point with Axis momentum being broken. So the last part of the section, again, it's important to know who wins or who loses, but the significance is really the focus, and you should find some significance to each of these battles that take place in the Pacific, Europe, and the Mediterranean. So also this week, please take a look at chapter 27, section 2, because we'll bring the war back home. We'll take a look at how our citizens are fighting on the home front. So take a look at the crash course episode also, because that should give you a lot of information about how we fight in many ways back home. And in the meantime, keep washing your hands, continue to social distance, and stay safe. We will get together as soon as it's safe for us to get together again. I miss you guys. Bye.